There are few across Thedas who don't know the story of Andraste, Bride of the Maker, Lady of Sorrow, Last of Restitution, Lady of Perpetual Victory, and Prophet. She is known for her teachings that became the foundation of Andrastianism. But more importantly, she is known for her story. The story of a slave who became the Bride of the Maker and was then burned at the stake. Her mark on Thedas is everlasting. Her story has been passed down through the ages with retellings through scholars and myths. So while much is contested around her story, here is the tale of Andraste. Originally known as Augusta, Andraste's birthplace is debated. Several cities declare theirs as her birthplace, including the Orlesian city of Jader and Denerim. Denerim is considered a site of pilgrimage for Andraste followers, who travel from far and wide just to touch her birth rock. Born in the same year as the end of the First Blight, Andraste is believed to have been born in the year -203 Ancient to a Syrian woman named Brona and her father Eldorath. Brona was a tribeswoman of the Syrian, and she had married Eldorath to form an alliance between the Syrian and the Alamari tribes. She had claimed to have saw visions of her daughter in her dreams of her daughter's life, betrayal, and death. She loved her daughter fiercely, and her shade represents the sorrow and regret of seeing her daughter's fate and being unable to stop it. A dream came upon me as my daughter slumbered beneath my heart. It told of her life and her betrayal and death. I am sorrow and regret. I am a mother weeping bitter tears for a daughter she could not save. Her father was a chieftain of one of the largest Alamari tribes in the region that would become Northern Ferelden. Alongside her mother and father, she had a half-sister to her father's side, Halaser. Halaser was born to a woman who was not Eldorath's wife, and such relationships were frowned upon, even though they did happen. Because of such, Halaser was welcomed into the family, but the fate of her mother was not welcoming. What happened to her mother is unknown, but it was believed that she was either exiled or killed by Andraste's mother, Brona. Andraste and Halaser would become close, and although Halaser died young, Andraste was forever changed. The circumstances around her death are mysterious, and what exactly happened still remains a mystery. But according to Emperor Cordelius Dracan I, Andraste woke up in the middle of a stormy night to find her sister acting strangely. Halaser was following lights into the woods. Confused, Andraste followed her sister, and the rest remains undocumented. An act of violence would occur, and Halaser would be found dead in a burned clearing. Her mysterious wounds looked to be infected beyond standard weapons, and as her body lay there, the forest was filled with sparks of fire. Andraste was found alive, but pale and clearly affected by whatever occurred. No one knows what happened to the two sisters, and while Halaser's life was cut brutally short, Andraste would remain unsure of what happened and would later become sick. The health of her lungs would deteriorate, and because of this, she would become unable to bear children. Her physical health was impacted, and she was changed after this in other ways as well. After that night, she would become still for long periods of time, unable to be moved or roused from this stillness. She would claim to have heard voices from old memories and talk of strange auras or the sound of bells. With so much mystery around the events of that night, the Syrian people blamed spirits or a possible blighted beast, and the Alamari tribes blamed their rivals, pointing fingers at their enemies. Many years later, Andraste looked back on that night and would begin to recall what happened. Blaming hearsay, she would suggest that the alchemist consort, Halaser's mother, whispered to the old gods. In the year 930, when a warden visits an untouched ancient temple in the Frostback Mountains, they come across the gauntlet, and within the temple are 8 spirits that have been summoned. Brona, Andraste's mother, is one of these spirit shades. If the warden is successful in answering the test of faith, Brona will disappear. If an incorrect answer is given, Brona will turn to an ash wraith and attack the warden. The riddle is echoes from a shadow realm, whispers of things yet to come. Thought's strange sisters dwells in night, is swept away by dawning light. Of what do I speak? The answer is dreams. But this riddle seems to mirror what happened to Halaser during that mysterious night of her death. At the age of 16 in -187 Ancient, Andraste was married to Mafarath to strengthen the alliances of the Alamari tribes. Their marriage, which was the largest alliance in the south at the time, would create a border that spanned the Palanese through the Fertile Crescent to the Banorn. While their marriage was successful in creating this alliance, Andraste's inability to bear children would result in Mafarath taking a concubine. With this concubine, Gillivan, they would sire 3 children, Isarath, Evrion, and Verald. When Gillivan died, Andraste adopted the 3 boys as her own, and her health would somewhat improve, to the point where she could give birth to 2 of her own children. Andraste would have 2 daughters, Ebris and Vivial. And although the 2 girls were the daughters of Mafarath, they were kept out of the public eye, and they were never counted as true heirs, and were not allowed to marry, though they both had consorts. They were allowed to have families on their own outside of marriage, and they both did. Ebris would go on to have a child of her own, but just like her mother, she was also weak, and having a child was a toll on her already struggling body. She would go on to die of the plague in her late 20s. Ebris's daughter, Ali Vimar, who outlived her young mother, would go on to marry, but like her mother, she too would die young, dying on a voyage to Denerim less than a month after her mother's death. She would not have any children. Andraste's other daughter, Vivial, would go on to fall in love with a Tevinter mage named Regulin. Vivial was a strong-headed woman, and her relationship would defy her family. This was a very controversial relationship. A Tevinter mage with an Alamari woman was never going to be received well, and because of this, the 2 exiled themselves so that they could be together. They would go on to have children, but all of their children were daughters. Vivial's daughters would go on to have their own daughters, and they would marry into other families and take the names of those families. Their history has been lost to time, and during the Second Blight, all traces and survivors' records were lost. With Andraste's only surviving lineage existing through Vivial and her daughters, and their presumed ability to only have daughters, then Andraste's bloodline may still exist. It is just undocumented. And this was actually on purpose. Vivial wanted all documentation and traces of her family gone. Sometimes she would even appeal to Andraste believers to aid her as well. Andraste's heirs most likely exist, but there's no documentation. Andraste's life and her bloodline have become a topic of desire, with many claiming to be her descendants, and changing her tale to fit their narrative, including many, even men, who claim to be her descendant. Whatever the truth is, as of current, there are no known heirs to Andraste. Recovering from the First Blight was hard on the people of Thedas, including Andraste's people. Civil unrest from the silence of the old gods was growing. Outposts were growing short of supplies, and Alamari settlements were being threatened. During one raid, Andraste's father Eldorath was killed by Tevinter soldiers and mages, who then seized their settlement. Andraste was kidnapped, and the settlement was burned to the ground. Andraste would go on to be sold into slavery, and with her father now dead, the Alamari leadership would pass to Mafarath, who would then become chieftain of the largest Alamari tribe. The tribe was extremely loyal to Eldorath and his daughter Andraste, and with the chieftain position being passed to Mafarath, he knew the only way to keep their loyalty was to get Andraste back. So he negotiated her freedom from the Tevinter slavers who had taken her. What happens to Andraste next is recounted both by her own words and tales, so the exact truth is somewhat muddied. As recorded by Dracon, Andraste was loyal to her people, and the traditions of her people were close to her heart. After the death of her sister and what happened that night, Andraste spent most of her time searching for meaning in what she had seen. She was searching for the voices she had heard, and result, she was searching for the Maker. She would find him and his influence in everything. Visions and immobility troubled her, but these were moments where she found the Maker. Documentation of what Andraste actually saw or heard are fuzzy, and what remains are the legends of the Maker speaking to Andraste. Legend says that every night the Maker spoke to her, She would tell him of her despair for the future of her people, and when she shed a single tear, the Maker would capture it in a vial. After 13 nights of her despairs and capturing her tears, the vial was full, and when dawn came, she would see her first vision of the Maker. Her visions of the Maker started when she was young, and she would later intern these dreams as the answers to the questions that plagued her. She believed the Maker was a supreme being who had abandoned his people when the worship of the old gods began. Shortly after her marriage to Mafarath, she would appeal to the gods, but her prayers would go unanswered. Instead, she would sing, and enchanted by her voice, the Maker would appear to her. The Maker would show her everything he had created, the Fade, the world, and all the creatures within them. He would show her how his people had forgotten him, and how he had left them to their fate because of it. He would invite her to join him at his side, to rule all of creation alongside him. But instead, she asked him to return to humanity's side and forgive them for straying from his worship. She would not leave her people, and upon seeing her resolve and dedication, the Maker agreed to give man another chance. It is said that the Maker also gave Andraste a Mabari to stand at her side to aid her and comfort her. He would be the sworn companion of the Maker's holy bride, though this is a contested detail. With new resolution in support of the Maker, she would then urge the people of the Elamari to worship the Maker as well. She spread her dreams and visions of the Maker to many who were willing to listen. She would tell of his sadness at what had been being done to his children, and with the aftermath of the blight and the suffering it caused, many people found her stories of the Maker as a source of comfort. Andraste became a focus for the rage of an entire people. They rallied behind her, and she became a conduit for the Maker. And with this, her visions became more vivid and personal. Her purpose was becoming more clear. During this time, Tevinter was changing as well. It is believed that Andraste was the reason behind the Maker striking down Tevinter, which was experiencing drought, wildfires, and the weakening of the earth beneath them. Around the year -180, when Andraste was 23, she declared an exalted march against the Tevinter Imperium for their beliefs of the heretical old gods. Between these disasters and the aftermath of the blight that had only ended a few years prior, Tevinter was suffering from famine and drought. The earth seemed to be helping the Elamari people. Any shifting of the lands was considered a divine act in favor of the Elamari people. The exalted march on the now weakened Tevinter was successful, and she would go on to join forces with Shartan, a former elven slave whose enemy was also the Tevinter Empire. History around Shartan isn't clear, and he may have been a title or an idea rather than a single person, but the impact of Shartan on the elven people is certain. Born into Tevinter slavery, Shartan dreamed of a world where the elves could be free and encouraged an elven uprising. Shartan and his elven slaves would join Andraste's exalted march in -171 Ancient. The details of his uprising are really unknown, but it's said that Andraste and Shartan's battles were being fought at the same time, and as Andraste's army approached Shartan's, he was taken to speak with her. The two leaders negotiated an alliance and became equals against Tevinter, and they would fight Tevinter on the Vicarian fields. Andraste would go on to name Shartan her champion, and she would give him gifts, including the Glandivalis, a sword that originally belonged to her mother Brona, according to the dissonant verses of the Chant of the Light. Their relationship was cause for speculation. One keeper, Gisharel of the Ralafaran clan, claimed that Andraste called Shartan brother. Some believe that Shartan and Andraste were lovers. Whatever they were, they fought side by side with Andraste's promise to return the Dales to the elves. The Battle of the Vicarian Fields was a major victory for Andraste and Mafarath, who was a masterful tactician. He capitalized on his wife's following and her inspiration. And with this and the Tevinter Empire in its weakened state, the battle was bloody, but the favor was in Andraste and the Elamari people were victorious. Despite the victory for the Alamari people, they still suffered major losses, including most of the Alamari leadership. They may have won the battle, but the Alamari could not keep up with their exalted march. The further Andraste pressed into the Imperium, the more resistance she encountered, and the less willing Tevinter was to give up what was theirs. There were major losses following the Vicarian field battles, but regardless, Andraste's commitment to the Maker was never stronger. As the Maker's conduit, her mission was to destroy Tevinter entirely and guide the Chant of Light from every living mouth. What happens next isn't documented precisely, and the motives of Maferath aren't exactly known. But around this time, his mission and his wife's were becoming at odds. Realizing that the war wasn't against the Alamari people, but that the full force of Tevinter was directed at his wife, he decided to let them have her. Maferath conspired with Archon Hissarion and allowed Tevinter forces to enter Andraste's stronghold in the city of Navarra. She was then captured and taken to Tevinter, where she was then burned at the stake. This was the cruelest and most painful punishment that Tevinter could enact. Her death was meant to set an example. Archon Hissarion, who had been the one to order Andraste's execution, would immediately regret his actions, seeing the error of his ways as soon as she had been burned. Instead of letting the flames take her, it was Hissarion who put the sword through her heart to end her misery. This would become the Blade of Mercy. Her Mabari, gifted to her by the Maker, would also remain at her side until her death. Having fought alongside her in every battle, and right up to her death, he followed her to the pyre. Limping out to the fire, he died with her. Shartan and 100 elves tried to charge to the pyre to free her, but all were killed by a hail of arrows, and they died along with Andraste. Eventually, Shartan's history with Andraste would be removed from the Chant of Light, after the Exalted March of the Dales that would happen many years later. And his involvement is considered heretical, and is now referred to as the Heresy of Shartan. Justinia V would return these passages to include Shartan in the Cumberland Chant of Light in modern-day Thetis. Shartan and his elves gave their lives trying to save her. She was important for many people, and Tevinter expected her death to be a celebration, but instead she became a martyr. They saw a woman who suffered the cruelest fate. The Alamari had a martyr, and Tevinter's resolve was now weakened. It is believed that Maferath suspected this might be the case, that he might have planned for this exactly to happen. It is also suspected that Maferath may have been jealous of his wife's influence, and believed that her death would end her cult. Perhaps he was jealous of the Maker himself, or perhaps he was jealous of his own wife. Whatever the reason, his betrayal was clear. After her execution, surprisingly, Maferath was both instrumental in her death and he was instrumental in preserving her legacy. He also kept his word to the elves. In -165, he returned the Dales to the elven people. Elves from all over Tevinter would migrate here, and this dangerous journey called the Long Walk was harsh, and many elves died on their way. In the decade after Andraste's death, Maferath didn't rule as a tyrant that he was often depicted as. He was calculated instead. He divided power amongst his 4 children, intending for their nations to stand as a barrier if the Tevinter Empire attempted more war. He let his sons rule and distanced himself from the spoils of his betrayal. Maybe he knew it would not last. Maybe he wanted them to take the blame instead of him. For when his betrayal was revealed, Maferath and his entire court were slain. His death isn't acknowledged in the verses of the Chant of Light, and there is no known burial site. With the distancing of Maferath from his son's reign, his sons were spared initially when Maferath's court was ended. Evrion, the middle son, had been leading a nomadic group that would become the Free Marches. In the decades after Andraste's murder, Evrion's leadership gave his people peace. He did not care about power. All he cared about was spreading the word and teaching of his mother and her sacrifice. When the truth of his father's betrayal was revealed, he and his children would abandon their lineage and disperse their holdings to the various tribes. This resulted in the Free Marches becoming secular instead of becoming a singular nation. 2 of Evreon's children would try to lay claim to the legacy of Andraste, despite not being true heirs, and they would not survive the backlash. The rest of his line would fall into obscurity. The youngest of Maferath's son, Verald, would go on to rule Navarra, but when he ruled, he tried to leverage his connections to Maferath and gain sympathy because of his mother's legacy. It worked for a short time, but when the truth was revealed of Andraste's murder, he was instantly vilified alongside his father. His court was killed, and the young king fled to neighboring lands that would eventually become Orlais. His brother Isarath was ruling Orlais at the time, and he had spent the last decade uniting his people. Isarath was just and wise, and worked diligently to fortify the idea of Orlais and instill an identity among the desperate tribes. His grand unification was successful, and it was both celebrated and reviled. It was unknown at the time, but his unification of his people would result in centuries of stability for the Empire of Orlais. Eventually, when Maferath's betrayal came to light, Isarath would keep his rule. He was also separated from his family and legacy at the time, so he was ultimately seen as a victim as well. And while his people still favored him, it was ultimately his own brother and wife that would be his downfall. When Verald fled to Orlais after the downfall of his own rule, him and Isarath engaged in a power struggle. Verald went behind his brother's back and conspired with Isarath's wife, Jehavis, to uplift Verald instead of her husband. Jehavis, who was not angered by the death of Andraste, but was instead angered by the upheaval caused by unifying Orlais. The two would kill Isarath and would marry shortly after. Jehavis's betrayal spurred the radical different direction that the Orlesian culture would then follow. Jehavis, considered the inventor of the Great Game, would then seed rebellion against her new husband, and within a decade, she was the leader of the People's Rebellion against him. This resulted in Isarath and all of his children being killed, and Jehavis would go on to rule Orlais for 42 years. The death of Andraste would go on to affect several regions and people of Thedas, but those most affected were those close to her. Havard had been the right arm of Maferath since childhood. The two were inseparable. But when Maferath betrayed Andraste, Havard tried to stand between her and her end, but was cut down for his loyalty. Somehow, Havard survived and made his way to Minrathous covered in his own blood. In desperation, he fought his way to her final resting place, praying that he could stop her from being burned at the stake. Unfortunately, he was too late, and by the time he arrived, he only found a pile of cold ashes in the rain. Although she was dead, by the time he arrived when he touched her ashes, he was healed and filled with courage. And so he gathered what remained of Andraste and brought her back home to the Alamari to find a safe refuge for her ashes. They would later be placed at the Temple of Sacred Ashes in Haven. Andraste's death caused a domino effect across Thedas, beginning from the very moment she was executed. Archon Hassarian would regret his actions in calling for her execution, trying to give her mercy rather than letting her burn. But after her death, he claimed to have heard the voice of the Maker and would repent her execution entirely. In negative 160, Hassarian forcibly converted the Imperium to Andrastianism and outlawed the worship of the old gods. The true reasons behind his conversion were debated, but his repenting of his actions allowed him to stay in power. 10 years later, it was him who would reveal Maferath's betrayal, and he would then go on to declare the Tevinter Imperium an Andrastian nation. By negative 130, Andraste's followers had organized her teachings into hymns, creating the first chant of light. Andrastianism would become the national religion in many regions, including Orlais and Tevinter. The Chant of Light has gone through many changes, with verses being removed or added or edited throughout the years. So much of what her exact teaching and history were are unclear. There are many tales of Andraste, the Maker's bride, the prophet, and her important life and journey. But as to what exactly happened during her life and death remains a mystery. Many stories are skewed towards the historian telling the tale, and many stories have changed over time. But throughout it all, her influence on Thetis remains to this day. And that is the story of Andraste, or at least what we actually know about her. I know that Dragon Age is in a very weird position right now, and I honestly considered whether or not I even wanted to make this video. I haven't really talked about this on Twitter, but I did talk about it on Blue Sky. But after the release of Veilguard, covering Dragon Age became really weird. People started taking everything that I say and turning it into content, and I just stopped talking about Dragon Age entirely. And now that Dragon Age is kind of dead, I don't know what it looks like going forward. I have another video on Kalstrock that I haven't recorded yet, and I'll probably do it at some point, but it's really hard to want to get invested in Dragon Age content when the franchise is really, it's on ice. I mean, we're not getting anything for a very long time, and it really depends on if Mass Effect 5 even does well. So yeah, I don't know how I feel about Dragon Age. This is a weird time to be a Dragon Age fan. And honestly, I was hoping after Veilguard we'd get like some comics, maybe a book. I don't know. I feel like a book or a comic could have helped. So yeah, I don't know what my Dragon Age coverage looks like going forward. Anyways, let me know what you think of Andraste's story. Let me know how you're feeling about Dragon Age right now. Again, I know it's very complicated. Anyways, thank you for watching. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you to my Patreon members and my channel members especially. I appreciate everything. Thank you so much, and see you guys next time.